What made your disabled child speak up for the first time? My son hasn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years, but on his first day of high school, I watched him wheel himself to the entrance ready to try. 3 hours later, I got the call that changed everything. Mrs. Gladwell, your son is in the nurse's office. There's been an incident. When I arrived, my son was on a cot, clothes torn, bruises already forming on his arms. His wheelchair was nowhere to be seen. The nurse wouldn't meet my eyes. What happened? Some students claim they were playing, she said carefully. Your son, he had to make his way to class without his chair. Made his way? He crawled. She whispered it like saying it quieter made it less horrific. Down the main hallway. Other students filmed it. My son, my baby who once spent 6 months learning to hold a pencil, had crawled across filthy school floors while teenagers filmed him. His hands were scraped raw. His pants were ripped at the knees. Where's his wheelchair? It was found in the dumpster behind the gym. The wheels are damaged. I wanted to scream. Instead, I knelt beside my son. He wouldn't look at me, just kept making this small sound in his throat, his warning that a meltdown was coming. Who did this? The principal, Mr. Garrett, walked in. We're investigating, but the students involved claim they're actually his friends, that they were trying to help him. Help him by stealing his wheelchair? They're saying these marks, he pointed to my son's bruises, were already there, from home. The room went cold. Excuse me? They're claiming you and your husband abuse him, that they were trying to document it for his safety. That's ridiculous. Is it? A woman suddenly walked in. Business suit, clipboard, dead eyes. I'm Marisa Ferreira from Child Protective Services. We received multiple reports about injuries on your son. From the kids who threw him out of his wheelchair. From concerned students who say they've witnessed ongoing abuse, she corrected. We'll need to interview your son. My son was rocking now, his usual self-soothing mechanism. Marissa wrote something down. Is he often agitated at home? He's agitated because he was assaulted. Mrs. Gladwell, these students, Morgan Evans, Chris Brennan, Vince Park, they're honor students. No disciplinary records. Why would they lie? Morgan Evans, the superintendent's son. Chris Brennan, whose father owned half the commercial buildings in town. Vince Park, headed to Yale next year. I understood now. Interview my son, I said. Ask him what happened. Marissa looked skeptical. The school says he's largely nonverbal. He communicates. You just have to listen. They set up in the conference room. My son sat in his borrowed wheelchair. The old one from the nurse's office that was too small, made his back hurt. Marissa asked her questions. My son just rocked. Has anyone at home ever hurt you? Nothing. Do you feel safe with your parents? More rocking. We can protect you if you tell us the truth. That's when something changed in his face. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No, he said. Clear as day. First word in 3 years. Marisa leaned forward. No, you don't feel safe? No. Louder now. My parents. My heart was breaking. Not because I thought he'd lie, but because I knew how much speaking cost him. My parents never hurt me. Each word seemed to physically pain him. Never. 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 Tears were streaming down his face. They help. They love. Then who hurt you? Marissa asked, suddenly interested. My son pointed toward the door, where we could see Morgan and his friends in the principal's office, laughing about something on their phones. Them, he whispered. Threw me, ground, kicked, took chair. Why didn't you tell anyone? My son looked at her like she was stupid. And for the first time in 3 years, he gave a full explanation. Who would believe the kid who can't talk? Marissa's face changed. Are there others? Other kids they hurt? My son nodded, then did something I'd never seen. He grabbed a pen with his shaky hands and started writing names. Our neighbors, his teachers, his own grandfather, and someone I never would have guessed in a million years. But made me want to throw up immediately. Up immediately. My son had written my father's name on that list, and suddenly 3 years of my dad's comments about making him tougher, and not coddling him took on a different meaning. But I couldn't process that right now because Marissa was reading the names, and Mr. Garrett's face had gone pale. I grabbed my son's hand and told Marissa we were leaving to get him checked out at the hospital, and she didn't argue, just said she'd be in touch tomorrow about next steps. The borrowed wheelchair squeaked as I pushed my son through the hallways toward the exit, and I noticed how other students stopped and stared, some with their phones out like they wanted to film this too. My hands shook on the wheelchair handles, but I kept moving, got him to the car, lifted him into the passenger seat because the wheelchair wouldn't fit, and I'd have to come back for it later. The drive to the emergency room took 15 minutes, and my son didn't make a sound the whole way, just stared out the window with tears drying on his face. The ER nurse took one look at his torn clothes and visible bruises, and got us into a room within minutes. She asked what happened, and I explained about the assault at the school, the wheelchair theft, him crawling across the floor, and she wrote everything down before leaving to get someone from their forensic team. A woman in scrubs came in about 20 minutes later and introduced herself as Layla Jenkins, and something about her calm voice and gentle movements made me feel like maybe someone would actually see what had been done to my son. She explained she would photograph and document every injury, that this would create a medical record that could be used if we pursued legal action, and she asked my permission before touching him. Layla started with his hands, turning them over carefully to show the scraped palms embedded with grime from the hallway floor. She took photos from multiple angles and made notes on a tablet, describing the injuries in specific detail that made them sound worse than they looked, but also more real. His knees came next, pants already torn away to reveal raw skin, and small pieces of debris still caught in the scrapes. She cleaned each wound with careful precision while talking to my son in a low voice, explaining what she was doing before each step. The defensive bruising on his arms got the same treatment, photos and measurements and notes about the finger-shaped marks that showed where someone had grabbed him hard. Then she looked at his legs and found the pressure marks from sitting in that too-small wheelchair for hours, red indents that matched the shape of the armrests, and she documented those too as evidence of improper equipment. The whole process took over an hour, and my son stayed remarkably still through all of it, only making his throat sounds a few times when she had to touch particularly painful spots. By the time Layla finished, the sun was setting outside the hospital windows, and my husband walked into the room looking scared and confused. He'd gotten my text about the hospital and driven straight from work, still in his uniform from the plant. I stepped into the hallway with him, and we had a whispered conversation that felt too loud in the quiet corridor. He wanted to know if we should wait to see what the school did before hiring a lawyer, worried about the cost and worried that making this bigger would somehow make things worse for our son. I was already scrolling through disability rights attorneys on my phone because I knew with absolute certainty that the school would protect those boys and their important families before they ever protected our kid. He kept saying we should give them a chance to make it right, that going legal right away might poison any chance of working together. But I'd seen Mr. Garrett's face when those boys blamed us for the bruises. I'd heard the superintendent's son laughing in that office while my son was interviewed by CPS. My husband's voice got tighter as we talked, both of us trying to keep it down so our son wouldn't hear us arguing, and finally he said fine, look into lawyers, but he wasn't sure about this approach. I wanted to scream that there was no good approach when your kid gets assaulted at the school and then accused of being abused at home, but instead I just nodded and said we'd figure it out together. That night after we got home and got our son settled, I drove to the police station alone while my husband stayed with him. The detective who took my statement had the kind of professional, neutral face that felt cold, but at least he wrote everything down. I described the wheelchair theft, the forced crawling, the filming, the bruises, the destroyed chair in the dumpster, and he nodded and typed it all into his computer. He explained that assault cases involving juveniles got complicated, especially when the accused students were claiming they were trying to help a friend, and especially when the victim had communication difficulties that made testimony challenging. But he promised a thorough investigation, said he'd review any video evidence and interview witnesses, and gave me a case number to reference. I asked what would happen to the boys, and he said that was up to the DA's office once they reviewed the evidence. Could be anything from diversion programs to juvenile charges depending on what they found. The whole interview took about 40 minutes, and when I walked back to my car, I felt like I'd just reported a crime that no one really believed was a crime. The next morning my phone rang at 8 and it was Marissa from CPS. She said she needed to schedule a home visit and laid out what she called a preliminary safety plan that made my stomach drop right there in my kitchen. They wanted to inspect our home, interview family members separately, observe how we interacted with our son, check his bedroom and our refrigerator and his medical records. I said yes to everything because I knew I had no choice, but the implication that we might be the danger made me want to throw my phone across the room. Marissa scheduled the visit for 2 days out and reminded me that cooperation was important, and I said we had nothing to hide while thinking about how violated I was going to feel having a stranger judge our home and our parenting. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and made a list of things I needed to do, and the first item was find a lawyer who specialized in disability rights and education law. I reached out to the Parent Support Network from my son's middle school through their Facebook group, explaining briefly what had happened and asking if anyone knew a good attorney. A mom I barely knew, someone whose kid had been in a different classroom, sent me a private message within an hour with the name Veronica Fisher and a phone number. She said Veronica had helped her family fight for proper accommodations 2 years ago and was tough but compassionate, exactly what we needed. I called and left a message, my voice shaking as I tried to summarize what happened without breaking down, describing my son crawling down that hallway while students filmed him. Veronica called back within 2 hours, said she'd heard about the case already through the Parent Network grapevine and wanted to help. We scheduled a meeting for the next day, and she told me to bring every piece of documentation I had, every email from the school, every medical record, every photo. I hung up feeling like maybe I'd found someone who would actually fight for us instead of trying to make this go away quietly. That night, my son had a massive meltdown triggered by catching sight of himself in the bathroom mirror. The bruises on his face had darkened to deep purple, and the scrapes on his hands were scabbed over, and seeing his own injuries seemed to break something loose inside him. He started rocking hard, making those throat sounds that meant he was losing control, and I sat down on the bathroom floor with him. I didn't try to stop the rocking or make him talk, just stayed close and kept my voice low and steady while he worked through it. An hour passed, then another, and gradually the rocking slowed and the sounds got quieter, until he was just leaning against me exhausted. I realized sitting there on the cold tile that this trauma was going to be with him for a long time no matter what justice we managed to get, that even if those boys got punished and the school got held accountable, my son would still carry this. The next day, I met Veronica in her downtown office, a small space with files stacked on every surface and disability rights posters on the walls. She listened to everything while taking detailed notes in a legal pad, occasionally asking specific questions about timelines and documentation. Then she explained how we could approach this through multiple angles. ADA violations for failure to accommodate, IDEA protections for special education rights, civil rights claims for disability discrimination, and criminal charges for assault. She was direct about the challenges we faced given the students' family connections, the superintendent's son being involved, the wealth and influence protecting these boys. But her confidence that we had a strong case, that the evidence was clear and the law was on our side, gave me the first real breath I'd taken in days. She said she'd start with a litigation hold letter to preserve evidence and we'd build from there, and I signed her retainer agreement right there without even looking at the cost, because my son needed someone this competent on our side. That afternoon, I checked my email and found a message from the school district sent to all parents. It described an unfortunate misunderstanding between students and praised the school's commitment to student leadership and conflict resolution. No mention of assault. No mention of a stolen wheelchair. No mention of a disabled student forced to crawl across the floor. Just careful language about misunderstandings and the district's values. I forwarded it to Veronica with shaking hands, and she responded immediately that this was evidence of their PR strategy to minimize what happened, that they were already trying to control the narrative before we could tell the truth. That evening, a short video clip surfaced online, posted anonymously to a local Facebook group. Someone had filmed my son on the ground in the hallway, surrounded by students with their phones out recording him. The angle showed his face, showed the fear and confusion, showed him trying to pull himself forward with his scraped hands. I watched it once and felt physically sick. The humiliation of strangers seeing my child like that, making me want to delete every social media account I had. But I sent it to Veronica and she called me within minutes saying this public evidence actually strengthened our case, that the school couldn't claim this was a private matter between friends, when there was video proof of what happened and multiple students involved in filming it. My son saw himself in that video when another student texted it to him. I was in the kitchen when I heard the crash of his phone hitting the wall, and I ran to his room to find him hitting himself in the head with both fists. I grabbed his hands and called for my husband, and together we spent 2 hours using every technique we'd learned over the years to help him through it. Redirecting his hands, keeping our voices calm, not restraining him too much because that made it worse, just staying present while he worked through the overwhelming feelings. We tried his communication app, but he couldn't focus enough to type. Just kept hitting and rocking until he finally exhausted himself and collapsed against me. My husband and I looked at each other over our son's head, and I could see we were both thinking the same thing, that we were going to make sure those boys and that school understood exactly what they'd done to our kid. I stared at my father's name on that list and felt my stomach turn over. The other names were teachers, a neighbor, people I could handle confronting, but seeing my own dad's handwriting there made me want to throw up immediately. I grabbed the paper and folded it before anyone else in that conference room could see all the names, then thanked Marisa for her time and got my son out of there as fast as I could manage. We drove home in silence, my son exhausted from all that speaking, and me trying to process that my father had hurt him, and I never knew. That night I couldn't sleep, just kept thinking about all the times I'd left my son alone with my dad, all the times I'd trusted him. The next morning I called Veronica before my son even woke up and told her about the list, about my father's name being on it. She listened without interrupting, then said she'd send out the litigation hold letters that day to everyone involved. I could hear her typing while we talked, already drafting the formal notice. She explained she'd send letters to the school district, to the 3 families of the boys who hurt my son, to the superintendent, the school board, the district's legal counsel. The letters would demand they preserve all evidence including videos, text messages, emails, disciplinary records, anything related to what happened. She'd make it clear we weren't going away quietly, that this was serious legal action coming. I approved everything and hung up feeling like at least something was moving forward, even if I felt sick about my father. That afternoon, Marisa showed up for the home visit she'd scheduled, clipboard in hand, and that same professional expression that gave nothing away. She walked through our house room by room, asking questions about our daily routines, how we discipline our son, what medical care he receives. I followed her around answering everything honestly while feeling like a criminal being investigated in my own home. She opened our refrigerator and looked inside, checking we had adequate food, I guess. She went into my son's bedroom and examined his bed, his medical equipment, his communication devices. She asked to see his medical records, and I pulled out the thick binder I keep with all his documentation, years of doctor visits and therapy sessions and specialist appointments. Marisa flipped through it carefully, taking notes on her clipboard. She asked about medications, about his daily schedule, about who supervises him and when. Every question felt like an accusation, even though her tone stayed neutral. My husband came home from work in the middle of the visit, and I could see him tense up immediately when he saw Marisa sitting at our kitchen table with her paperwork spread out. He answered her questions too, explaining how we split caregiving duties, how we coordinate his medical appointments, how we handle his meltdowns. The whole thing took almost 2 hours, and by the end I felt drained and angry that we had to prove we weren't abusing our own child. That evening after Marisa finally left, I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone named Glenn Caldwell. I almost ignored it thinking it was spam, but the preview text mentioned disability rights and education issues. I opened it and read that he was a journalist covering these topics for the local paper, and he'd heard about what happened to my son. He asked if I'd be willing to talk about it, said he wanted to tell the story properly, and shine light on how schools fail disabled students. I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, wanted someone to tell the truth publicly about what those boys did and how the school protected them. But another part of me was terrified of making things worse, of my son's face and name being in the paper, of more attention and more people judging us. I told Glenn I needed to think about it and talk to my attorney, then closed Facebook and tried to focus on getting dinner on the table. The next day, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was the mother of the boy who was hurt at the high school. My whole body went tense, ready for another attack or accusation. But she said her daughter had autism and went to the same school, and she wanted me to know Morgan and his friends had mocked her daughter multiple times over the past year. She described incidents in the cafeteria, in the hallways, cruel comments about her daughter's stimming behaviors and social difficulties. Every time she'd reported it to the school, they'd dismissed it as normal teenage teasing, boys being boys, nothing serious. She said she was too afraid to come forward officially because her daughter was graduating in a few months, and she didn't want to jeopardize that, or make her daughter a target for more harassment. But she wanted me to know I wasn't alone, that this was a pattern, that Morgan had hurt other kids and gotten away with it because of who his father was. After we hung up, I sat there feeling this strange mix of validation and rage. Validation that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just about my son, that there was a pattern of behavior the school ignored. Rage that other kids had suffered and nothing changed, that the school protected bullies instead of victims. That night, my husband and I had our first real fight since all this started. He'd been supportive through everything, but when I told him about Glenn the journalist and that I was considering talking to him, my husband's face changed. He said he was worried about our son becoming a public spectacle, about strangers knowing our business, about the boys' families coming after us harder if we went public. I argued that silence was exactly what let people like Morgan get away with hurting kids, that maybe public pressure was the only way to force real change. We went back and forth for over an hour, voices getting louder, neither of us budging. He kept saying he just wanted to protect our family, keep us safe and private. I kept saying that speaking up was how I protected our son, how I made sure this didn't happen to other kids. We didn't resolve anything before bed, just went to sleep angry on opposite sides of the mattress, and I lay there in the dark, feeling this new stress layered on top of everything else. The next morning, I checked my email and found a message from the school proposing a meeting to discuss what they called a restorative justice approach. I opened the attached document and read through their proposal with growing disbelief. They wanted to facilitate a conversation between my son and the students involved, have them talk through what happened and work toward reconciliation. The proposal even suggested having one of those students serve as my son's peer buddy to help him navigate school and build positive relationships. I read it twice to make sure I was understanding their audacity correctly. They wanted my son to sit down with the boys who threw him out of his wheelchair, who filmed him crawling, who then accused us of abuse, and have a friendly chat about feelings. They wanted one of his attackers to be his helper at the school. I forwarded the email to Veronica with the subject line asking if they were serious, my hands shaking with anger as I typed. Veronica responded within minutes, her email explaining this was a classic institutional move to avoid accountability by framing assault as a relationship problem that could be solved with dialogue. She said schools loved restorative justice because it let them avoid real consequences for students and claimed they were being progressive and trauma-informed. She drafted a response declining their proposal and reiterating our demands for proper investigation and real consequences for everyone involved. I read her letter and approved it immediately, hitting send with satisfaction. I felt relieved to have someone who spoke their language and wouldn't let them manipulate us with their therapeutic buzzwords and false concern. That evening, I sat down with my son after dinner, thinking about what Layla the nurse had said about gentle questioning and giving him time. I pulled up his communication app on his tablet and asked if there were other people who had hurt him that we needed to know about. He looked at me for a long moment, then slowly started typing on the screen with his shaky fingers. It took almost 20 minutes, him typing and deleting and typing again, his face scrunched up in concentration. Finally, he turned the tablet toward me, and I read through the names he'd listed. Some I expected from the paper list he'd written at the school. Some were new. And then I saw my father's name again, spelled out clearly this time, and my heart broke all over again. I asked my son if he wanted to tell me what happened with Grandpa, and he typed out short phrases describing how my father would grab his arms too hard, would yell at him for stimming, would call him weak and say he needed to toughen up. Each word felt like a knife. I called my father that night after my son was asleep, my hands sweating as I dialed. When he answered, I didn't bother with small talk, just asked him directly if he'd ever hurt my son. There was this long silence on the other end of the line, and then my father said he was just trying to teach him to be tougher. He said coddling wasn't going to help my son in the real world, that sometimes kids needed firm handling to learn. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened to him make excuses. I told him he wasn't welcome around my son anymore, that he needed to stay away from our family. He started to argue, his voice getting defensive and angry, but I hung up before he could finish. I sat in my dark kitchen crying for the relationship I thought we had, for the father I thought he was. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Ahmed Clark, a school board member I'd never met or heard of before. He said he'd heard about the situation with my son and wanted to meet privately to discuss options. I read his message multiple times, immediately suspicious of his motives. Was he genuinely concerned, or was this damage control? The district trying to manage me through a friendly board member? I forwarded the email to Veronica asking what she thought. She called me back within an hour and said having a board member engaged could be strategically useful if we were careful, that we should meet with him but not share anything we wouldn't want the district to know. She said to listen more than talk, to feel out whose side he was really on. I wrote back to Ahmed agreeing to meet, my finger hesitating over the send button as I wondered if I was making a mistake. The next day, I drove to the coffee shop Ahmed suggested, a small place near the district office that made me wonder if meeting here was strategic on his part. He was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in, a guy in his 40s wearing a polo shirt and khakis, looking more like a dad at a soccer game than a school board member. He stood up when he saw me and shook my hand with a firm grip that felt genuine. Then we both sat down and ordered coffee from the server who came by. Ahmed didn't waste time with small talk. He leaned forward and said the district had a long history of protecting certain families, especially ones with money or political connections, and that he'd been trying to change that culture from within for the past 2 years since he got elected to the board. I asked him directly if he could help us, and he was honest in a way that actually made me trust him more. He said he couldn't promise specific outcomes because he was only one vote on a 7-member board. But if we filed a formal complaint with the board about what happened to my son, he would push hard for an independent investigation instead of letting the district investigate itself. I left that coffee shop feeling something I hadn't felt in days, a cautious hope that maybe not everyone in the system was working against us. 3 days later, I got an email from the school scheduling an emergency IEP meeting, and when I forwarded it to Veronica, she immediately called me and said she was coming as my advocate, that I shouldn't walk into that room alone. The morning of the meeting, I picked her up from her office and we drove to the school together, and she spent the whole drive coaching me on what to expect and what language to use. When we walked into the conference room, my stomach dropped because the district had brought their own attorney, a sharp-looking woman in a suit who introduced herself as the district's legal counsel, plus the principal, the special education coordinator, and the school psychologist. It was 5 of them and 2 of us, and the power imbalance was so obvious it made my hands shake. But Veronica matched their energy immediately, setting her briefcase on the table with a solid thunk and pulling out her own stack of papers. She started by laying out exactly what accommodations my son needed to safely return to the school, speaking in this calm but firm voice that made it clear she knew the law better than they did. She talked about his communication needs, his mobility requirements, the documented safety risk given what had just happened, and the district's legal obligation under IDEA to provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. During the meeting, I spoke up and requested an independent educational evaluation and a one-on-one aid for my son, citing both his communication needs and the clear safety risk. The district attorney jumped in immediately, saying that budget constraints made a full-time aid unrealistic and that they needed to balance my son's needs with the needs of other students in the district. I felt my face get hot because I knew this was coming. But Veronica was ready. She looked directly at the attorney and explained in this measured tone that budget is not a legal justification for denying necessary accommodations under IDEA, and that if the district couldn't provide appropriate services, they were required to contract with outside providers at their expense. She pulled out printed court cases to back up what she was saying, sliding them across the table one by one. The special education coordinator looked uncomfortable, and the principal kept glancing at the district attorney like he was hoping she would make this go away. Veronica kept talking, explaining that we had documented evidence of the assault, medical records showing my son's injuries, and witness statements about the school's failure to intervene, and that all of this would become part of the public record if we had to file for due process. That afternoon, after I got home and was still processing everything that happened in that meeting, my phone dinged with a new email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line just said security footage, and my heart started pounding before I even opened it. The email itself was blank except for an attachment, a video file that took a minute to download. When I clicked play, I saw hallway security camera footage from the day of the incident, and I could see everything. The timestamp showed it was right before lunch period. My son was wheeling himself down the hallway, and then Morgan and his friends surrounded him, and even though there was no audio, I could see them laughing and grabbing at his wheelchair. I watched them lift my son out of his chair and set him on the floor, watched them wheel his chair away while he tried to grab for it, and then I saw what made my hands shake so hard I almost dropped my phone. Multiple adults walked past. A teacher glanced into the hallway, made direct eye contact with the situation, and kept walking like she had somewhere more important to be. Another staff member walked by on the opposite side, looked right at my son on the ground, and kept going. I forwarded the video to Veronica and the detective immediately, typing with shaking fingers that this proved the school's failure wasn't just about the students. It was about every single adult who saw what was happening and did nothing. I spent that evening watching the footage over and over, rewinding and pausing and watching again. What destroyed me wasn't just seeing my son on the ground trying to pull himself forward with his arms, wasn't just seeing those boys laughing and filming him on their phones. It was seeing that teacher glance into the hallway, watching her eyes make contact with the situation, and then seeing her turn and keep walking like my son was invisible. The systemic failure was right there in digital form, time-stamped and dated and impossible to deny. I finally understood that this fight was bigger than 3 mean teenagers. This was about an entire institution that had decided my son didn't matter enough to protect, that had created a culture where adults could walk past a disabled kid in crisis and feel okay about it. I watched the video one more time and then closed my laptop because I couldn't look at it anymore, but the images were burned into my brain. The detective called the next morning while I was making coffee, and I answered on the first ring hoping for good news. He said the video was helpful and they were definitely using it in their investigation, but then his tone changed and I knew what was coming. The DA was hesitant to file assault charges against juveniles based primarily on humiliating footage, rather than evidence of serious physical injury. He explained that prosecutors had to think about what they could prove in court, and what a jury would convict on, and that cases involving disabled victims and privileged defendants were always tricky. I felt something cold settle in my chest as he talked. He suggested we focus on the civil case and school accountability, said that might be where we'd see more results. It felt like the system failing us again, but at least he was being honest about the limitations instead of making promises he couldn't keep. I thanked him for his time and hung up, then sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing for a long time. When I called Veronica later that morning to tell her about the detective's call, she didn't seem surprised. She said she'd been thinking about our strategy anyway, and wanted to pivot our approach. She suggested we file a civil rights lawsuit against the district for disability discrimination and failure to protect, which would put serious pressure on them to settle and implement real policy changes. She outlined the risks in her usual straightforward way. It would be public, meaning our names and my son's situation would be in court documents that anyone could access. It would take time, probably months or even over a year before we saw any resolution. And we might not win everything we were asking for, because juries were unpredictable and judges had a lot of discretion. But she also explained that doing nothing meant the next disabled kid who enrolled in that district would face the same treatment, the same institutional indifference, the same adults walking past when they needed help. I told her I needed to talk to my husband before making that decision, but I already knew what my answer would be. That night, I showed my husband the security footage, and I watched his face change as he saw what I'd been seeing on repeat in my head. We sat together on the couch after the video ended, and had the conversation we'd been avoiding for days about whether to talk to Glenn the journalist. My husband was scared. I could see it in how his hands kept clenching and unclenching, scared of our son becoming a public spectacle, and scared of the attention it would bring to our family. But after watching that footage of adults walking past our child, something shifted in him. He said if the system wouldn't hold people accountable through criminal charges, maybe public awareness could force institutional change. We decided together that night, sitting in our quiet living room with the video paused on my laptop screen, that we would do the interview. The next morning, I called Glenn and agreed to talk, with the conditions that our names would be kept confidential, and my son's identity would be protected. Glenn said he understood, and that he'd work with us to tell the story in a way that focused on the institutional failures rather than exploiting my son's situation. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman introduced herself as Lucille Horton, the CPS supervisor reviewing Marissa's initial findings. Her tone was noticeably different from Marissa's, more measured and less suspicious from the very first sentence. She said she'd reviewed all the documentation, looked at the medical records from the hospital, examined the security footage, and interviewed the school staff. She acknowledged that the evidence clearly supported our account of what happened, and that the coordinated reports against us appeared to have been retaliatory, likely filed by the families of the students involved to muddy the waters. She explained that while she couldn't close the case immediately because protocol required a certain timeline, she was downgrading the safety concerns and reducing the monitoring frequency. We'd have one more follow-up visit in a month, and then the case would be closed with no findings. I thanked her and felt a small weight lift, even though I was still angry that the investigation had happened at all. Angry that we'd been put through that extra layer of trauma just because some rich families wanted to protect their kids. That evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when my son came in using his communication app on his tablet. He'd been practicing with it more since the incident, getting faster at typing even with his shaky hands. He rolled up next to me and turned the tablet screen toward me, and I read the sentence he'd typed out slowly and carefully, over what must have been 10 minutes. I want to go back to the school, but I'm scared. The words were so simple, but they gutted me because they showed he was still thinking about his future, even after everything that happened. We sat together at the kitchen table, and I promised him that we wouldn't send him back until we had real protections in place, until we knew he'd be safe and supported. He nodded, and his fingers moved across the screen again, typing out "thank you," and I had to turn away for a second because tears were running down my face. His trust in us was still intact despite everything, despite the fact that we'd sent him to that school and he'd been hurt there, despite the adults who'd failed him, and the system that had questioned whether we were the ones hurting him. He still trusted us to protect him, and I was determined not to let him down. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my phone before even getting out of bed, and there it was, Glenn's article on the front page of the local news website, with a headline about disability discrimination in our school district. I read through it twice, my heart pounding as I saw how he'd laid everything out without using our names, the security footage showing adults walking past my son, the pattern of protecting certain families while ignoring disabled students who needed help. He'd included quotes from Veronica about what the law requires for accommodation and protection, and by the time I finished my coffee and checked Facebook, The article was already being shared in 3 different parent groups with dozens of comments. Parents I'd never met were tagging friends and writing about how this finally explained things they'd noticed. And I sat at my kitchen table watching the shares climb past 50, then past 100, feeling something shift in a way I couldn't have made happen on my own. That afternoon, the school district posted an official statement on their website and social media calling Glenn's article incomplete and misleading, defending their commitment to serving all students with dignity and respect. I read their carefully worded response and felt my jaw clench at how they made it sound like Glenn had gotten the facts wrong. But then I started scrolling through the comments section, and something unexpected happened. Other parents were sharing their own stories. A mom whose son with Down syndrome got locked in a bathroom by classmates while teachers ignored his aide's requests for help. A dad whose daughter with epilepsy was told she was faking seizures for attention. Parent after parent describing how administrators had looked the other way when their disabled kids faced bullying or denied basic accommodations. The public pressure was building in the comments and shares in a way that felt bigger than just our situation, and I screenshot some of the stories to send to Veronica, because they showed this wasn't an isolated incident but a pattern. That evening I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with an email from Ahmed, the school board member who'd met with me at the coffee shop. He wrote that the board had held an emergency session that afternoon and approved funding for an independent investigator to review how the district handled our incident and to look at their disability accommodation policies more broadly. It wasn't everything we needed, but it was tangible progress, the kind of thing that wouldn't have happened without Glenn's article putting pressure on them and Ahmed pushing from inside the system. I forwarded the email to Veronica and my husband, and for the first time in weeks I felt like maybe we were actually moving forward, instead of just fighting to stay in place. 2 days later, Marisa showed up for her follow-up interview, and I could tell immediately that something had changed in how she approached us. She went through her checklist and asked her questions, but this time she was clearly just completing the required process, rather than looking for problems. She walked through our house and noted that our son appeared well cared for, that our home was safe and clean and appropriate for his needs, that the medical records and therapy schedules showed consistent care. She sat at our kitchen table and told us the allegations against us had not been supported by any evidence, and that she'd be recommending the case be closed with no findings. I thanked her and felt a small weight lift off my shoulders, even though I was still angry that we'd been put through this investigation at all. Angry that those boys and their families had been able to weaponize CPS against us, just because they didn't want to face consequences. The following week, Veronica called to tell me she'd filed the civil rights lawsuit against the school district that morning. She'd named specific failures in the complaint, how they didn't accommodate my son properly, how they failed to protect him from known harassment, how they showed deliberate indifference to disability-based discrimination. The filing was public record, and by that evening Glenn had already written a follow-up article detailing the legal claims and what they meant. I read his piece while my son was at therapy, and it generated another wave of comments and discussion about how the district treated vulnerable students, parents sharing the article and talking about whether their own kids' schools did any better. Within 3 days, the district's attorney reached out to Veronica about setting up mediation. She called me to explain that this was standard, that they wanted to avoid the discovery process and a trial that would expose more of their institutional failures to public scrutiny. We talked through the pros and cons, and I told her we'd agree to mediation, but only if it was clear we weren't interested in a settlement that just gave us money while letting them continue the same policies that had put my son in danger. She said she'd make that position clear to their attorney, and we scheduled the mediation for 3 weeks out to give both sides time to prepare. Around the same time, my son started working with a new speech therapist who specialized in augmentative communication. She came to our house twice a week and brought a tablet with a more sophisticated app that let him build longer sentences and save phrases he used frequently. I watched him work with her, his shaky hands moving slowly across the screen as he learned the new interface. And one afternoon, he successfully typed out a full complex thought about wanting to try a new food he'd seen at the store. His face lit up when the app read his sentence aloud in its mechanical voice. And I felt this surge of hope watching him gain tools to advocate for himself and communicate what he needed without having to struggle through speaking words that cost him so much effort. Then someone online figured out who we were, despite Glenn's attempts to protect our identity, and the harassment started. Messages appeared in my Facebook inbox calling me an attention-seeking parent who was exploiting my son's disability for money and fame. Someone created a fake account to comment on every post I made, accusing me of coaching my son to lie and using him as a pawn in a lawsuit. I screenshot everything and sent it to Glenn, who advised me to document all of it, adjust my privacy settings, and not engage with the harassers no matter how much I wanted to defend myself. He wrote another piece a few days later about how families who speak up about disability discrimination routinely face this kind of retaliation, how it's designed to silence them and make them back down, and reading it helped me understand that the harassment meant we were threatening people who benefited from the current system. My husband and I had another difficult conversation that week about the toll this fight was taking on our family. He sat across from me at the dinner table after our son was asleep and said he was worried about our son's privacy being violated and about our safety now that people were sending threatening messages. I told him I felt like we were finally being heard after years of being dismissed and ignored, that staying silent hadn't protected our son, so speaking up was our only option. We went back and forth for over an hour, and we didn't fully resolve our different comfort levels with how public this had all become, but we agreed we needed to start couples counseling to handle the stress without letting it destroy our marriage. The school board scheduled a public meeting with disability accommodations on the agenda, and Veronica spent an hour coaching me on how to deliver effective public comment. She helped me write a 3-minute statement that was specific and factual, and focused on policy changes rather than raw emotion, though she said it was okay to let my voice show how much this mattered. The night of the meeting, I stood in line with other parents waiting to speak, my prepared statement printed out and folded in my shaking hands. When they called my name, I walked to the microphone and looked out at the board members and the audience and started reading, my voice only shaking a little as I described what happened to my son and what needed to change to protect other disabled students. The room went completely silent as I spoke, and when I finished and walked back to my seat, I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some sympathetic, and some hostile, but at least now they'd heard the truth directly from me instead of filtered through official statements and damage control. 2 days after the board meeting, I got a call from someone identifying himself as a district administrator who wanted to discuss options for resolving our concerns without further legal action. He laid out their proposal over the phone. The district would provide private tutoring for my son at home for the rest of the year, cover all his therapy costs including the new communication specialist, and offer us a payment of $15,000. In exchange, we'd sign an agreement not to discuss the incident publicly and drop the civil rights lawsuit. I told him I needed to talk to my attorney and hung up. When I called Veronica, she wasn't surprised at all. She explained that districts often try to buy silence because it's cheaper than fighting a case that exposes systemic failures, and the NDA requirement was the real goal because it would prevent us from warning other families or pushing for policy changes. We talked through the pros and cons for almost an hour. The money would genuinely help with medical bills, and the tutoring would give my son a safe learning environment, but signing away our right to speak felt wrong. I kept thinking about the other parent who'd called me, the one too scared to come forward because her daughter was graduating soon. If we took this deal and stayed quiet, how many more kids would get hurt because no one knew the pattern existed? Veronica said the choice was ultimately mine, but that she'd seen too many families take settlements, and then watch the same thing happen to someone else a year later. I told her we weren't signing. 3 days later, I received a personal email from the superintendent himself, Morgan's father. He wrote that as a parent, he understood my concerns and wanted to meet privately to discuss how we could move forward in a way that protected all the students involved. He suggested coffee at a neutral location, just the two of us, no lawyers or formal proceedings. He ended the email by saying that sometimes parent-to-parent conversations could accomplish more than legal battles. I forwarded it to Veronica immediately. She called me within 20 minutes and her tone was sharper than usual. She explained this was a classic intimidation tactic dressed up as reconciliation, that he either wanted to pressure me into backing down or get me to say something without legal protection that they could use against us later. She strongly advised me not to meet with him under any circumstances. I spent that evening drafting a response email with Veronica's guidance. I kept it professional and brief, stating that all communication regarding this matter needed to go through my attorney and copying Veronica on the message. I hit send and felt this weird mix of relief and anxiety, knowing I'd just refused a direct request from someone with significant power in our community. Glenn's investigative piece came out the following Monday morning, and it was much longer and more detailed than his first article. He'd interviewed 3 different disability rights lawyers who all said our district had significantly higher rates of accommodation denials compared to similar districts in the state. He included quotes from 2 former district employees who spoke anonymously about pressure they'd felt to minimize special education costs and protect certain families from consequences. The article laid out specific data showing that students with wealthy or politically connected parents faced discipline at much lower rates than other students, even when the violations were identical. By that afternoon, the comments section had exploded with parents sharing their own stories, and the article was shared across multiple parent groups and disability advocacy networks. 2 days later, Glenn called to tell me the state education department had announced they were opening a compliance review of the district's special education practices. He sounded excited but cautioned that state reviews moved slowly and didn't always result in meaningful changes, but at least it was official scrutiny from outside the district's control. Lucille from CPS called me that same week to officially close our case. She went through the formal language about no findings of abuse or neglect and how the investigation was complete. Then her tone shifted slightly, and she acknowledged that the timing and coordination of the reports against us had raised questions, especially given that they all came from families connected to the students involved in the incident. She couldn't say more than that officially, but the implication was clear. She offered to connect us with family support services that could help with respite care and therapy resources, explaining that even though the case was closed, we qualified for voluntary support programs. I accepted immediately because we desperately needed more help managing everything. She emailed me a list of contacts and resources that afternoon, and I felt grateful that at least one person in the system had treated us with basic decency, even while following procedures that felt designed to punish us for speaking up. Ahmed reached out to update me on the independent investigator the board had hired. He couldn't share too much because the investigation was confidential, but he told me the investigator had a strong background in disability rights law and education compliance, and wasn't someone who would write a whitewash report just to protect the district. I gathered all our documentation, made copies of everything including the security footage, and created a detailed written timeline of every interaction from the first day of school through the present. The investigator's assistant contacted me to schedule a meeting, and I spent hours preparing, organizing everything chronologically, and highlighting the key failures at each stage. When I met with the investigator, she listened carefully and took extensive notes, asking specific questions about accommodation requests we'd made before the incident and how the district had responded. She didn't make any promises about her findings, but her questions suggested she understood the systemic nature of what had happened. Glenn connected me with a digital forensics expert who specialized in video authentication for legal cases. She reviewed all the footage we had, both the clips that had been posted online and the security camera footage from the hallway. She confirmed everything was authentic and unedited, and she pulled metadata that showed exactly when and where each video was filmed. She explained that defense attorneys often try to claim videos are taken out of context or edited to look worse than the actual events, so she prepared a detailed technical report that addressed those arguments before they could be made. The report included timestamps, device information, and frame-by-frame analysis showing no signs of manipulation. Veronica was thrilled when she reviewed it, saying this kind of expert testimony could be crucial in mediation because it eliminated any wiggle room for the district to claim the videos didn't show what they clearly showed. The following week, I received a call from an attorney representing Vince Park. He explained that Vince wanted to apologize directly to our family and was willing to provide a detailed statement about what happened and who else was involved in exchange for our support of reduced consequences for him. The attorney was careful to frame it as genuine remorse rather than strategic positioning, but I couldn't tell which it really was. I told him I needed to discuss it with my attorney and my son before making any decision. That night, I sat with my son and used his communication app to explain the request. He took a long time typing his response, his hands shaking as he worked through the words. Finally, the app read out his answer. He said he was angry at all of them, but that Vince was the only one who seemed sorry, and he wanted to hear what Vince had to say, even though it wouldn't fix anything. I called Veronica the next morning, and we talked through whether this was genuine accountability or just Vince trying to get a lighter punishment. She said it could be both, that people's motivations are rarely pure, but that having one of the students willing to provide detailed testimony about the incident and the planning behind it could strengthen our case significantly. We agreed to consider it but made no promises about supporting reduced consequences. My son surprised me a few days later by using his communication app to tell me something he'd been holding back. He typed slowly and carefully, building a long message about a teacher at the school. He said there was a teacher named Miss Ed Broderick who used to make comments in class about how he needed to be toughened up, and that getting special treatment wasn't helping him learn to deal with the real world. He described how she would sometimes ignore his accommodation requests during class, like extra time on assignments or permission to use his communication device, and how she'd made him feel like asking for help was wrong. He said other kids had heard her comments and it made them think treating him badly was okay. I felt sick reading his words because it meant the problem went so much deeper than 3 cruel teenagers. The adults who were supposed to protect him had instead created an environment where hurting him seemed acceptable. I immediately documented everything he told me and sent it to Veronica, who added it to our growing file of district failures. Veronica filed an emergency motion for injunctive relief the next day. She asked the court to order the district to immediately provide my son with a properly fitted wheelchair to replace the one that was damaged, assign him a trained one-on-one aide who specialized in communication support, and create a monitored safety plan that included specific hallway routes and regular staff check-ins. The motion included all our evidence, the expert reports, and detailed documentation of every accommodation the district had failed to provide. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Veronica called me after filing to say she felt cautiously hopeful, given how strong our evidence was, and how much public attention the case had generated, but she warned me that courts moved slowly, and that even a favorable ruling might not give us everything we needed. The parent backlash hit me harder than I expected. Someone started a petition on the PTA Facebook page claiming I was damaging the school's reputation and making it harder for all students by forcing expensive accommodations that would take money away from regular education programs. The petition had over 100 signatures within 2 days. I started hearing whispers at the grocery store and seeing people I knew from the school events cross the street to avoid talking to me. One parent I'd considered friendly posted on Facebook about how some parents were just looking for a payout and using their kids to get attention. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew who she meant. I sat in my car in the parking lot after seeing that post and just cried because I'd known speaking up would be hard, but I hadn't been prepared for how personal and mean the attacks would feel. That night, I had to remind myself over and over that their comfort with things staying the same didn't make me wrong for demanding my son be safe at the school. But it still hurt to be treated like the problem instead of the people who'd actually hurt my child. Up immediately. My own father's name sat there on the page in my son's shaky handwriting, and the betrayal cut deeper than anything Morgan or his friends had done because this was family, someone who was supposed to protect him. I took photos of everything he'd written with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady them against the table. Marissa watched this unfold with a completely different expression now. No longer the suspicious investigator, but someone who understood she'd walked into something much bigger than a schoolyard incident. She asked my son if he felt safe going home with me, and he nodded immediately, reaching for my hand with his scraped fingers. We left the school that afternoon with Marissa's card and a promise that she'd be following up on all the names he'd provided, not just investigating us. The emergency hearing happened 3 days later in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. Veronica had filed the motion the morning after our meeting, and somehow she'd gotten us in front of a judge faster than I thought possible. My son sat in his borrowed wheelchair next to me, his communication app open on the tablet we'd brought. The district's attorney was a tall woman in an expensive suit who kept shuffling papers and whispering to the superintendent, who'd shown up personally probably because his own son was involved. The judge was an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, and she looked at my son with the first genuine interest I'd seen from any official in this whole mess. Veronica stood and explained what we were asking for, laying out the documented safety failures and the immediate need for accommodations. Then she did something brilliant. She asked the judge if my son could provide testimony using his communication app, with her reading his typed responses aloud for the record. The district's attorney objected immediately, claiming it wasn't proper testimony if he wasn't speaking himself, but the judge shut that down fast. She said the law required reasonable accommodations for witnesses with disabilities, and if this young man could communicate through technology, that was exactly what they were going to allow. Watching my son type out his answers was one of the hardest things I've ever sat through. The judge asked him directly what happened that day, and he typed slowly, carefully, building each sentence word by word, while the whole courtroom waited in silence. Veronica read aloud as he typed. He described Morgan and Chris grabbing his wheelchair, Vince filming on his phone, being thrown to the ground, crawling down the hallway while students laughed and took videos. He typed about the fear, about not being able to get help, about adults walking past and not stopping. Then the judge asked him if he felt safe going back to the school without protection, and he typed one word that Veronica read in a voice that cracked slightly. Number. The judge leaned forward and asked why not, and my son typed out a longer response about how the school had promised to keep him safe, but didn't. How the boys who hurt him were still there. How he was scared it would happen again because nobody stopped it the first time. His fingers were shaking on the screen by the end, and I had to grip the edge of my chair to keep from reaching over and pulling him into my arms. The judge's face had changed completely. She looked at the district's attorney and asked a question that made my chest tight with hope. She wanted to know why, given everything that had been documented, the district hadn't already provided the basic accommodations my son needed to be safe at the school. The district's attorney gave some answer about needing time to assess the situation properly, and concerns about setting precedents for accommodation requests. But the judge wasn't having it. She flipped through the documents Veronica had submitted, stopping on pages that must have shown the medical records and the security footage. She asked about the wheelchair that had been damaged and thrown in a dumpster, about the one-on-one aid that had been requested months ago through the IEP process, about the safety plan that should have been in place from day one. The attorney kept trying to redirect to budget concerns and staffing limitations, and each time the judge cut her off and went back to the legal requirements under IDEA and the ADA. By the time the hearing wrapped up, I could tell we'd won something, even if I didn't know exactly what yet. The judge said she'd issue her order by the end of the day, and Veronica squeezed my shoulder as we gathered our things. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she told me she felt good about how it went, that the judge clearly understood the urgency and the district's failures. We went home and waited. The order came through at 4:30 that afternoon, and Veronica called to read me the important parts before she emailed the full document. The judge had issued a temporary order requiring the district to immediately provide my son with a properly fitted wheelchair to replace the one that was damaged. They had to assign him a trained one-on-one aide who specialized in communication support, someone with actual credentials in augmentative communication devices. They had to develop a written safety plan that included specific monitored routes through the school, regular check-ins with designated staff, and a protocol for reporting any incidents of harassment or bullying. The order gave them 5 business days to implement everything, and required them to submit proof of compliance to the court. It wasn't everything we'd asked for in the lawsuit, but it was real protection with the force of law behind it. I sat on my couch reading through the full order on my phone, and for the first time in weeks I felt my shoulders drop slightly, some of the constant tension releasing. Because someone with actual power had finally seen what was happening and done something about it. The district announced their disciplinary decisions 2 days later in an email that went to all parents and staff. Morgan and Chris were each getting 10-day suspensions and had to complete 40 hours of community service with an organization that served people with disabilities. Vince's consequences were harsher because he was older, and because he'd been the one primarily filming. He was suspended for the rest of the semester, which was about 6 weeks, and he was barred from participating in graduation ceremonies, though he could still graduate and get his diploma. The email used careful language about taking bullying seriously and ensuring all students felt safe, but it never actually used the word assault or acknowledged what had really happened. I forwarded it to Veronica and she called me within 10 minutes. Her take was that the consequences felt inadequate given what they'd done to my son, but she also pointed out that getting any meaningful discipline for students with their family connections was actually significant. Most districts would have given them a slap on the wrist and called it handled. The fact that the superintendent's own son was facing a 10-day suspension and his Yale-bound star student was missing graduation ceremonies meant the public pressure and the court order were working. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was more than we would have gotten if we'd stayed quiet. 2 days after the disciplinary announcement, the district made another move that felt more meaningful than the student consequences. Mr. Garrett, the principal who'd tried to dismiss what happened as students playing around, was quietly placed on administrative leave pending the independent investigation's findings. The announcement came through an email from the superintendent's office using vague language about personnel matters and the need for objective review processes. At the same time, the school nurse who'd failed to properly document my son's injuries and hadn't reported the incident to authorities received a formal reprimand that went in her personnel file. Ahmed emailed me privately to say that both actions were direct results of the pressure the board had been getting and the preliminary findings from the independent investigator. The investigator had apparently found significant gaps in how the incident was handled from the moment my son arrived at the nurse's office. These administrative consequences felt more meaningful to me than the student discipline, because they acknowledged that the adults who were supposed to protect my son had failed, and there were professional costs for that failure. Lucille from CPS called one final time about a week after the court hearing to officially document the case closure. Her tone was completely different from Marissa's had been, professional but with actual warmth underneath. She told me that while the case was closed with no findings of abuse or neglect against us, they were keeping it in the system under a designation called Services Offered. That meant if we ever needed access to family support resources like respite care or therapy assistance, we could contact CPS and they'd help connect us without having to open a new investigation. She went through the official documentation, confirming dates and findings, making sure I understood we had no restrictions and no ongoing monitoring. Then she said something off the record that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. She told me she was glad we'd fought back, that too many families didn't have the resources or energy to challenge coordinated false reports like the ones that had been filed against us. She said cases like ours, where the reports were clearly retaliatory and the evidence overwhelmingly supported the family, helped CPS recognize patterns and be more skeptical of suspicious reporting clusters. It didn't erase the violation of being investigated in our own home, but it helped to know that someone inside the system understood what had really happened. We spent the next week adjusting to the new routine with my son's aide. Her name was Rita, and she was a patient woman in her 50s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and gentle hands that never grabbed or rushed my son. She had actual training in augmentative communication, and years of experience working with kids who had complex communication needs. The first day she came to our house to meet my son before school started back, and I watched her introduce herself by showing him her own communication app and explaining how she'd help him use his. She never talked down to him, never acted like his communication challenges meant he couldn't understand or have opinions. She asked him questions and waited for his answers, no matter how long it took him to type them out. By the end of that first meeting, my son had typed that he felt okay about trying school again with her there. The properly fitted wheelchair arrived 3 days later, delivered by a medical supply company the district had contracted with under the court order. It was the right size, with proper support for my son's back and legs, and it had working brakes and smooth wheels that actually rolled properly. When my son sat in it for the first time, he actually smiled, this small, relieved expression that made me realize how much pain he must have been in using that too small loaner chair all this time. Rita helped him adjust the footrests and showed him how to lock the brakes himself, treating the wheelchair like the important mobility device it was, instead of just a chair with wheels. Glenn published his follow-up article about a week after the court hearing, and this piece focused on the policy failures the case had exposed and the changes being implemented. He quoted from the judge's order, laying out exactly what accommodations the district had been required to provide, and why those basics hadn't been in place from the start. He included quotes from Ahmed about the school board's commitment to reviewing accommodation procedures district-wide, not just at the high school. The article mentioned the independent investigation and the administrative consequences for the principal and nurse, framing the whole situation as a catalyst for broader reform in how the district handled disability accommodations and bullying reports. Glenn had also gotten quotes from disability rights advocates talking about how common these failures were and how most families never had the resources to fight back the way we had. Reading the article helped me feel like the pain we'd been through might actually prevent other families from suffering the same way. It wasn't just about my son anymore. It was about changing a system that had failed too many kids for too long. Veronica called me on a Tuesday afternoon to say the district wanted to proceed with formal mediation rather than risk going to trial. She'd been expecting this because districts almost always preferred to settle once they realized they were facing strong evidence and bad publicity. She'd already prepared a detailed settlement proposal that included financial compensation for my son's medical bills, therapy costs, and the pain and suffering he'd experienced. But more importantly, the proposal included specific policy changes she wanted the district to implement. Mandatory training for all staff on disability rights and proper accommodation procedures. Regular auditing of how IEP and 504 plans were being implemented. A clear protocol for investigating and documenting bullying incidents involving students with disabilities. An anonymous reporting system so students and staff could report concerns without fear of retaliation. We spent hours on the phone and then in her office going over every detail of the proposal, because I wanted to make sure any agreement we reached actually protected future students, not just paid us off and let the district go back to business as usual. About 2 weeks after the court hearing, Vince's attorney reached out to Veronica requesting a restorative justice session. The attorney explained that Vince wanted to apologize directly to my son and take responsibility for his actions, and that he was willing to participate in a facilitated session with a trained mediator if we were open to it. Veronica and I discussed it carefully because we both knew this could be genuine remorse, or it could be a strategic move to help Vince's case. I talked to my son about it using his communication app, explaining what restorative justice meant and what the session would involve. I told him he didn't have to do it, that we could say no and it wouldn't affect our lawsuit or anything else. He typed for a long time, working through his thoughts slowly. Finally, he typed that he wanted to hear what Vince had to say, that he wanted to understand why they did it. We agreed to participate but set strict ground rules through Veronica. My son could leave anytime he wanted, no questions asked. Vince had to take full responsibility without making excuses or blaming others. Anything said in the session could still be used in the civil case if we needed it. The mediation couldn't be used to pressure us into dropping charges or accepting a smaller settlement. The restorative justice session happened on a Saturday morning at a mediation center downtown, in a room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle and tissues on a side table. The mediator was a calm woman who explained the process and the ground rules again, making sure everyone understood this was voluntary and focused on accountability and understanding. Vince sat across from my son and me, his parents beside him looking uncomfortable and worried. Rita was there too because my son wanted her support, and Veronica sat next to me taking notes. Vince started by reading a prepared statement that his attorney had clearly helped him write. It covered all the right points about taking responsibility and understanding the harm he'd caused, but it sounded rehearsed and legal. Then something shifted. Vince put the paper down and his voice cracked. He said he knew what they did was wrong while they were doing it, that he'd felt sick filming it but did it anyway because Morgan's approval felt important, and he didn't want to be the one who said no. He talked about seeing my son on the ground and knowing it was cruel, but convincing himself it was just a prank that would be funny later. My son used his communication app to type questions and Rita read them aloud. He asked why Vince filmed it instead of helping. He asked if Vince understood how scared he was, how much it hurt. Vince's answers were halting and uncomfortable, but they seemed genuine. He admitted he hadn't let himself think about my son's fear, because that would have meant admitting what they were really doing. The session lasted almost 2 hours, and by the end, everyone was emotionally exhausted. It didn't fix anything or erase what happened, but it was the only real accountability we'd gotten from any of the students involved. The only time one of them had actually faced my son, and admitted the truth without lawyers and school administrators running interference. I watch my son's shaky handwriting form letters on that paper, and my heart stops when I see my father's name appear among the others. The man who used to bounce my son on his knee when he was little, who claimed he loved his grandson, had apparently been part of the problem all along. Marisa sees it too and makes a note, and I realize this investigation just got a lot more complicated because now it's not just about the school and those boys, it's about my own family. That night after we get home and my son is finally asleep, I call my mother and ask her directly if Dad ever hurt him. There's a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she admits in a quiet voice that Dad thought tough love would help, that making my son do things without his wheelchair or ignoring his communication attempts would somehow make him stronger. I hang up without saying goodbye and sit in my dark kitchen trying to process that my own father, someone I trusted completely, had been hurting my child under the guise of helping him. My husband finds me there an hour later, and I tell him everything, and we agree that my father is not allowed near our son anymore. No exceptions, no matter how much it hurts. 3 days later, my mother calls asking if Dad can explain himself, saying he wants to apologize and see his grandson. I tell her no, that I'm not interested in hearing excuses about tough love, when what he did was actually cruelty disguised as discipline. She tries to argue that he meant well, that he was from a different generation. But I cut her off and explain that the boundary stands until he can genuinely acknowledge the harm he caused and show he understands why his behavior was wrong, not just apologize because I'm angry. It hurts to cut off my own parent, someone who raised me and who I thought would always have my back, but protecting my son has to come first. My mother cries on the phone and says I'm being too harsh, but I end the conversation and block my father's number because I can't handle his attempts to justify what he did. That evening, I find myself looking at old family photos, pictures of my dad holding my son as a baby, and I have to put them away in a box in the garage because seeing them makes me feel sick. The school year continues, and about 2 weeks after the restorative justice session, I get an email from the district with a single-line announcement that Mr. Broderick, the teacher my son identified, is resigning effective at the end of the semester. There's no explanation, no acknowledgement of why she's leaving, just a bland statement thanking her for her years of service. I forward it to Veronica, who confirms this is typical, that the district accepted her resignation to avoid the mess of a formal investigation or termination hearing. There's no dramatic confrontation where I get to tell Miss Broderick exactly what I think of her dismissive attitude toward my son's needs, no public accountability or apology, just her absence. It feels hollow because she gets to leave quietly while my son carries the impact of her treatment, but at least it means he won't have to deal with her anymore if he returns to that school. I tell my son about it using his communication app, and he types back that he's glad she's gone, but wishes she had to admit what she did wrong. I agree with him completely, but explain that sometimes the system protects adults even when they fail kids, and that's exactly why we're fighting to change things. After weeks of careful preparation with Rita helping him practice his roots and building his confidence, my son returns to the school part-time in early November. He's only attending his core classes with carefully planned routes that avoid the crowded main hallways, and Rita walks with him between classes to make sure he's safe. The first day, I'm a complete nervous wreck sitting at home waiting for the call that something went wrong, checking my phone every 5 minutes and unable to focus on anything else. When I pick him up that afternoon, I'm searching his face for signs of distress or new bruises, but he seems okay. He types, "It was okay" on his app, and shows me a photo Rita took of him in his science class, sitting at his desk with his properly fitted wheelchair and his communication device. No incidents, no harassment, no one filming him or stealing his chair, just a regular boring school day where he learned about chemical reactions and took notes. It feels like a miracle, this normal day that most parents take for granted, but that we had to fight so hard to make possible. On the drive home, he types that his science teacher was nice, and that another student asked him a question about his app, and I have to pull over for a minute because I'm crying too hard to drive safely. That same week, I find a support group for parents of children with disabilities that meets weekly at a community center about 20 minutes from our house. I almost don't go to the first meeting because I'm exhausted, and the idea of talking to strangers about everything we've been through sounds overwhelming, but something makes me walk through those doors anyway. The room has about 12 other parents sitting in a circle with coffee and cookies on a side table, and when I introduce myself and briefly explain why I'm there, several people nod like they've heard similar stories before. Over the next hour, I listen to other parents share about fighting school districts for accommodations, dealing with insurance companies that deny necessary equipment, and facing judgment from people who don't understand their children's needs. A mom whose daughter has cerebral palsy talks about how the school tried to put her in a separate classroom away from her peers, and another dad describes spending 3 years in due process hearings to get his son appropriate services. Walking into that meeting and hearing these stories makes me feel less alone than I have in months, like I've found people who understand this particular kind of exhaustion and determination that comes from advocating for your child in systems that weren't built with them in mind. We exchange contact information, and someone adds me to their group text where parents share resources and warnings about unhelpful providers, and I realize I've found people who get it in a way that even well-meaning friends don't. In mid-November, almost 2 months after that first terrible day, I receive a thick envelope from CPS with official letterhead. Inside is the final closure letter documenting that their investigation found no evidence of abuse or neglect, and that our family demonstrated appropriate care and advocacy for our child. The letter notes that we were connected with support services and that no further monitoring is required, and it includes Lucille's signature at the bottom. I read it 3 times to make sure I'm understanding correctly, that this nightmare part is actually over, and then I file it carefully in the folder with all our other documentation. I never want to forget how it felt to be investigated in our own home, to have someone scrutinize our parenting and question whether we were hurting our child, because I want to be able to help other families who face similar false reports. That evening, I tell my son that CPS closed the case and he won't have to talk to them anymore, and he types "good" on his app with more force than usual. My husband and I open a bottle of wine after our son goes to bed, not really celebrating because too much damage has been done, but acknowledging that we survived this part, and our family is still intact. The stress of everything has taken a real toll on my marriage, with my husband and me arguing more than we ever have, and struggling to connect beyond the logistics of appointments and legal meetings. We finally start couples counseling with a therapist who specializes in families dealing with disability-related stress. And in our first session, we're both able to admit how scared we've been, and how differently we've coped with that fear. My husband talks about feeling helpless and wanting to protect us by keeping things private, worried that public advocacy would make us targets and put our son through more trauma. I explained that advocacy felt like the only way I could protect our son, that staying silent would have meant letting them get away with what they did and leaving other families vulnerable to the same treatment. The therapist listens carefully, and then helps us see that we both want the same thing. We just needed to find ways to support each other's approaches, instead of fighting about whose strategy was right. She gives us homework about checking in with each other daily, and being specific about what kind of support we need, and we leave that first session holding hands for the first time in weeks. One evening in late November, about 2 months after the initial incident, my son is practicing with his communication app at the kitchen table while I make dinner. He's been using it more consistently and getting faster at typing out his thoughts, and I glance over occasionally to see what he's working on. Suddenly, he looks up at me with this expression I can't quite read and taps the voice output button. The mechanical voice reads out a full sentence he's typed carefully, word by word. The app says, "I am proud of myself for being brave," in that flat, computerized tone that somehow makes the words even more powerful. His own words, his own thoughts, expressed clearly through the technology that gives him a voice when speaking, is too hard. I have to leave the room for a minute because I'm crying, and I don't want him to think it's because I'm sad. I stand in the hallway with my hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face, because this kid who they tried to break is still here, still fighting, still growing. When I come back, he's watching me with concern and types, "Are you okay?" And I tell him yes, that I'm more than okay, that I'm so incredibly proud of him I can barely stand it. That night, after my son is asleep, I sit down at my desk and open the detailed timeline I've been keeping throughout this entire process. I add the latest updates about his return to the school, the support group, the counseling, his breakthrough with the communication app. I know this fight isn't over because the mediation with the district is still pending, the independent investigation hasn't released its findings yet, and we're still monitoring how they implement the court-ordered accommodations. But as I review everything we've documented, I can see how far we've come from that first horrible day. My son is safer than he was with his properly fitted wheelchair, his trained aid, and his communication tools. He has legal protections in place that didn't exist before. We've built a network of support from Veronica to Rita, to the parent group, to our therapist. The system didn't protect him the way it should have, and that failure will always be part of our story. But we're making sure it does better going forward. One policy change and accommodation at a time. I save the document and back it up to 3 different places because this record matters. Not just for our case, but for every family that comes after us. And that's the end of this one. I like turning small stories into something you can actually use in your own life. If this one helped even a little, that's a win for both of us. Subscribe so you're here when the next one drops.